Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode of the CRM Inbox series, we're going to establish our basic light and dark theming with CSS variables and also get our reset styles in place. With where we left off in the last episode, we committed our initial setup with our HTML and CSS files, as well as our assets stubbed out. With our HTML file open, let's start a live preview. So I hit Control or Command, Shift and P, and I have the live server extension, so let's open it with live server. And here you can see the preview has popped open in my browser. Now back in VS Code, let's open our terminal with Command or Control tilde. And what we want to do is create a new branch in Git so we can make all of our changes without touching master. And once our changes are complete, we can do a pull request and merge our changes back into the master branch. So first I'm going to type git branch, and you can see that we're on the master branch. Now to create a new branch, let's say git checkout -b, and let's call this branch add theming and reset. And it'll say that it switched to a new branch. And if we check with get branch one more time, you can see that we're on our new branch of add theming and reset. All right, so we'll come back to Git in a minute. We can close the terminal with Control or Command and tilde. Now that we have a branch to work from, let's start making our changes. So if we reference our designs in Figma, you'll recall that we have all of these color styles for the light and dark theming. And I would like to get all of these added in our app.css file as CSS variables. What's really cool about CSS variables is you can redeclare them. So when we toggle between the themes, we can basically just point our main background variable to either the light or dark version based on the theme. To illustrate this, let's just start with main background. So I'm going to go in and reference our HSL values. Another thing we can do is go to our particles page, and we built out our entire color palette here for easy reference. So for the dark theme, we have HSL 234, 12, and 23. In VS Code, let's go to our app.css. And I'm actually going to put our CSS variables above any reset styles that we have. So here we're going to say that the root element, let's establish our theming. And specifically, this will be our color book. And let's just stub out another comment for our dark theme. Typically, I don't have this many comments, but we have a lot of CSS variables, so I'm trying to stay organized here. All right, and in the dark theme, we have our main background dark variable. And this will be HSL 234, 12%, and 23%. And we'll similarly stub this out for our light theme. So this will be main background light. And let's grab the HSL value for this. All right, so this is also 234. We maintain pretty consistent hue throughout our whole color scheme. And we have 27% saturation, 98% lightness. I really should add percentages to the second and third values here. So that's an improvement I'll make outside of this video. All right, main background light was 234, 27% saturation, and 98% lightness. So from here, let's get this theming wired up for just a quick check of what we're doing. In our index.html, I like to add a class of app to our body element, just so we have something to target. And if we are working in a front-end framework, or if we somehow need to change the scope of this class, we can always do that in the future. So let's add a comment that these will be our reset styles. And then beneath this section, we'll have our app styles. So in our base app class, let's establish our normal CSS variables. So main background without a dark or light suffix. We want to point to our default theme. In this case, let's assume that the light theme is going to be our default. So main background points to the variable of main background light. Now, the last thing we need to do is actually set the background color to main background. If we look at our preview, you'll notice that the background has subtly changed. Let's open Inspector Tools just to see how it's coming into play. So if we target the body element, or the element with the app class, you can see that our background color is set to main background, which then refers to main background light. And if we were to color sample this, you can see that it's the off-white as intended. So the next step is to provide a way for the theme to automatically detect the operating system level preference from users. So for this, we can say @media and say prefers color scheme dark. If we open this up, we want to target our app class one more time. And in this case, we're going to point main background to our variable of main background dark. Now, if we give this a save and flip over to our preview, you can see that my operating system has the dark theme preference set. And so our background is now the main background dark. Now here in Windows, I've gone to my color settings, and you can see that my color is set to dark. If I toggle this to light, you'll see that this instantly updates with our CSS. So we have our operating system level preferences affecting our native UI, as well as our website. I'm going to toggle this back to dark for now. And going back to our code, this basically establishes the pattern that we're going to follow. We're going to add our separate variables for the light and dark themes. Our app is going to assume that we want to point to the light theme by default. And then if the user prefers a color scheme of dark, we're going to repoint these variables to the dark variation. Now to speed things up, I'm going to quickly go through and add all of our CSS variables for our colors, and then we'll move on to some of the other variables we can add to get our base styling in place. So I'm making my way through the various colors. I want to point out one thing that's a little unique to our situation, and that would be handling the gradients that we have for our different elevations. So in our color palette, we have these flat swatches for the background end and start points. But we'd also like to add the gradients themselves that we have inside of our color styles here. And you can see these are linear gradients on an angle, and they have the defined start and end points. So as a quick example of this, I've added our elevation 1 background start and end points for the dark theme. Now let's create the actual gradient here. So we have elevation 1, gradient, dark, and this will be set to linear gradient, and let's say 135 degrees to match the angle we had. And a really nice thing about CSS variables is how we can have nested references to other variables. So let's say var, this will be our elevation 1 background start, and this will be at our 0% start point for our gradient. Then next we have our elevation 1 background end, and this will be at 100%. And then what's great is we can again reference elevation 1 gradient in our theme, and it'll toggle between the light and dark theme as needed. But if we need to maintain the gradient, all we have to do is go to the nested references for our base color book. So I'm going to continue on getting all of our elevation gradients in place, and then we'll check in and tackle some more unique situations with variables. All right, so with the rest of our elevation colors and gradients set up, you can see that our variables are quickly increasing in size. But as long as we stay organized and have all of our light values referenced with our root variables for the default situation, and then override those for the dark theme, everything should be toggling as expected. Referencing Figma further, it looks like we just have some remaining component guide and other colors to add to the separate themes. And then from there, we'll tackle some of the shared colors that we have across both themes and move on to other variables such as our drop shadows and other design details. So I've got our remaining dark theme variables in place and the remaining light theme variables. We have them wired up for our default app, which is the light theme, and for our dark theme as well. What's left to do is tackle these shared styles. So in this case, we just need to add these variables once and reference them across both themes. Basically, for the dark theme, we're not going to override these, so it makes it pretty simple to implement. So in our root selector, where we are establishing all these CSS variables, let's create a new section with a comment, and these will be our shared colors. All right, and following that same pattern, we have all of our shared variables established here. You can see that we even have our accent gradient, which references the start and end points of the gradient, our logo colors, and the notification gradient as well. And since some of these gradients are unique to their implementation, it's okay if we hardcode HSL values here and there. And since the naming for these is already our default naming, which doesn't include light or dark in the name, we don't have to redeclare it for the app or within the media query for the dark theme. We can just reference these root variables directly. And this is typically what you do for CSS variables when you don't have to deal with light and dark theming. All right, so that's it for our color book. Let's move on to our drop shadows. And again, these will need to be separated out by our dark theme and our light theme. Back in Figma, we have our elevation 1 dark, elevation 2, our accent, and the same things for the light theme as well. If we inspect any one of these, you'll recall that we have multiple drop shadows to achieve a more realistic shadow effect. So the process for this would be to inspect the blur, X offset, Y offset, the actual color we're using for the shadow, as well as its opacity. So in this case, we have 32 pixel blur, 4 pixel Y offset, this color swatch, which is actually one of our existing colors, but in Figma you can't point to a color style within a drop shadow, and the opacity. So just to show how we'll turn this into a variable, we have our elevation 1 dark. There was 0 pixel X offset, 4 pixel Y offset, 32 pixel blur, and we're going to use HSLA so we can get the opacity that we're looking for. Now I know that that hex code is HSL 234, 12%, 8%, and we wanted 20% opacity, which is represented with 0.2. Next, we're going to add the secondary box shadow here. So if we reference this, our blur is 4, Y offset is 2, that same HSL value, and that same opacity. So in this case, we have 0, 2 pixel Y offset, 4 pixel blur, and that same HSLA. So 234, 12%, 8%, 0.2. And that completes our drop shadow variable. So we'll do the same for our various elevations and themes. All right, so with all those added, we'll do a similar pattern of referring to a definitive version of just elevation 1. That'll point to the light theme, and then we'll override with the dark theme as needed. So at this point, in our app class name, let's say that this is for our color book for this first section, and then drop shadows for this other section, just so we're staying organized with all of these variables. So again, elevation 1 is going to point to elevation 1 for the light theme. Let's make sure this is spelled correctly. Looking good. And just to reinforce this, let's add our section comments for this override with the dark theme. And redeclare that variable. Okay, great. I'll get the rest of these wired up real quick. With those added, there's only a few remaining variables that we need to add. So let's scroll back up to our root styling block here. I want to establish a variable for our typography. So this will be font family sans. And this will reference our Poppins font and sans serif. And we'll immediately use this in the body reset style here. So we'll say var font family sans. And if we give this a save and check out our preview, you should see that the font remains the same. So if we go to fonts, this is Poppins. I know this is extremely hard to read here, so we'll address the theming of the typography in just a second. Next up, let's incorporate the common font weights that we use throughout our design. And if we reference our fonts, we only use 2 of the font weights. So we have weight regular, and this will be 400, and weight medium at 500. Lastly, let's create a section for design elements, and this will be for things like transition. So creating a variable for transition, we want this to be 300 milliseconds ease in out, so that way all of the transitions in our UI have a consistent feel. And since these are not theme dependent, we don't have to redeclare them in any sense. All right, with all of our variables in place, Let's make sure that these sections are spaced out appropriately. And let's work further on our reset styles. The first thing I'm going to do is on the HTML element, I'm going to set box sizing to border box. So that way, any of our dimensions that we're setting incorporate the border in the width and height. To make sure this cascades to all elements, we're going to use the wildcard selector, as well as the before and after pseudo elements on everything in the DOM. And let's also set box sizing here to inherit. So that way everything is guaranteed to be border box. Lastly, on HTML and body, let's set the height to 100%. That's just a basic reset. In our body, let's set margin to 0. And I think that takes care of our basic reset styles. One thing that probably wouldn't hurt as a safeguard is to set the color of all text to our high contrast variable. And if we give this a save, we can look at our preview and see that the color is inheriting as well as the background color of the page. And once again, if we open up our operating system color preferences, this should toggle as expected. You can see that it's actually faster to toggle than the operating system itself. And this will be really fun to check our work as we go by toggling the theme as we start building out the rest of the UI. All right, the last bit of setup here, which will make building out the rest of the UI really fast, is to get our typography specs in place. So let's create a new section for type specs. And again, going back to Figma, we have our different type specs listed out here, as well as text styles in the sidebar. So starting with title 1, because our logo is going to be SVG, let's go through and get these type specs added. First, we have T title 1. This has a font size of 1.5 rem, a font weight of our variable, which is weight regular, and a line height of 2 rem. Now, typically, I would be establishing responsive type specs that would be followed up by a media query, or perhaps have everything encapsulated in media queries. But in the case of our design, we're building a desktop-only experience for this series. So we can continue on adding the rest of our type specs, just like this with a simple block. All right, with all of our type specs incorporated, there's just a couple more kind of utility classes that I like to have for every project. So let's create another section, and this will be for accessibility. And let's create a class of visually hidden. If you want, it's also common to call this something like screen reader only or SR only. I like to say visually hidden because it's a little more explicit about what it's doing. So in this case, we're going to write out some utility styles that are very specific to this use case. So this isn't something I usually memorize. It's definitely something I copy and paste from previous projects, but it's a well-vetted approach that I use across the board. So we set padding to 0, width to 1 pixel, height to 1 pixel, position absolute. And to visually hide this, we're going to say that the clip is set to a 1 pixel rectangle on every dimension. As a bit of progressive enhancement, we're going to use clip path and say inset 0 pixels, and go almost to 100% in terms of how far it clips inside. Overflow is going to be set to hidden, and border is going to be set to 0. Now again, this is definitely something I don't memorize, and it's very specific to this use case. Just to illustrate it, let's go to our heading level 1 and add this class of visually hidden. And if we look at our design, you can see that it's disappeared, but the key thing here is it's still available for assistive technology and it doesn't impact layout in any way. And this is important because if we said display none or visibility hidden, then screen reader technology and other assistive tech would not be able to read this important text content. So that's why we use this helper class throughout. All right, reverting that back to default, we have our accessibility helper class in place. And with all of our app theming variables established, we're in a really good place to continue building out the UI from here. So this is a great place to stop for this episode. So before we end, let's open up our terminal with Control or Command and tilde And let's get our work committed and pushed. So if we type git status, you'll see that we've modified these files. We want to git add all of them and add a commit message. So in this case, we completed the full scope of work for this branch. So I'm going to repeat the add theming and reset as the commit message. We're ready to push this, so let's type git push. All right, this is pushed. And going into our browser, I'm logged in GitHub here. Let's give this a quick refresh. And you can see that we now have 2 branches in our code base. So we can open a new pull request. And this is able to merge. Let's create this pull request. Verify that the files changed are what we expect. So we can see all of our variables in place. And just a slight modification of our HTML. Back to the conversation. This is typically where you would have questions after you review your files, and we would see that we have approvals coming in as well. In our case, we're kind of self-reviewing, so it's okay to merge this pull request into our master branch. This is all looking good. Let's confirm that merge. And it's safe to delete this branch in GitHub because it's no longer needed. It's just a temporary working space. So deleting that branch, go back to our code panel. You can see we only have 1 branch now. And going back into VS Code, if you'll recall, we're on our add theming and reset branch. So let's get checkout master. And it'll tell us that we're behind our origin in GitHub on the master branch by 2 commits. So we can git pull to get the latest changes. That's looking good. I'm going to clear my terminal real quick. And I always like to get rid of my working branches locally as well once I'm done with them. So git branch -D for delete and add theming and reset. And if we do git branch one more time, you can see that we're on master. Everything's cleaned up and we're ready for the next batch of work. So that's all the work for this episode. In the next episode, we'll start styling the UI directly, putting those CSS variables to work, and drafting out some of these components. So thank you so much for watching, and be sure to look out for the next episode.